Maybe you're sat at home and enjoying a hot beverage. Well, it might be worth considering what it is you're drinking. If you're drinking black tea, you're the winner because there's only 22 grams of CO2e in that cup of black tea. But if you're drinking a large cow's milk latte, that's 552 grams of CO2e. I am, of course, reading from Professor Mike Berners-Lee's revolutionary book, How Bad Are Bananas? We're delighted to have Mike with us. He's going to take us through to lunchtime here as our lunchtime keynote speaker. Professor Berners-Lee is part of Lancaster University. He's written 3 wonderful books. That was his first one. And we are giving away 100 copies of There Is No Planet B. I think we've given away a dozen or so already to those that are most engaged in the comments and the polls. So please just head along to the stage panel on the right-hand side of Hopin. Get involved, upvote the questions you most want to put to Professor Berners-Lee, and we'll be giving away lots of books over the rest of today. So what we're going to do is Professor Mike is going to give us a half-hour keynote, and then we're going to turn to some Q&As. We're going to clear out a lot of the Q&As from previous sessions so that we're asking questions that are really applicable to the content that Mike is going to present to us today. Mike, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. And thanks for inviting me to be here. It's great to talk to you all. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start with an outline of what I describe now as the polycrisis, and we'll see why in a minute. And then we'll have a look very specifically at what the implications are around transport, what's going on around transport, and very practically what we can all do about it. So next slide. So just very, very quickly about me. You've heard I'm a professor at Lancaster University. You've had a kind introduction to my 3 books that are up there. And just to say, I work with all sorts of businesses in all sorts of contexts at my business in Small World called Small World Consulting. And the way I would describe what we do is we help organizations to make an appropriate response to the climate and ecological emergency that we face. And that takes a very different shape for different organizations depending on who they are and what they're doing. Next slide. So I wrote There's No Planet B because I'd been working on climate change for probably 20 years, and it had become inescapably clear that if you want to do something about climate, you have to treat climate as one symptom of something much, much bigger that's going on for humanity right now. And the best way I know of starting to talk about that is to have a look at this graph of global energy use. And there it is. I've just drawn it back from 1860 with better data for the last 50 years or so. And there it is, going up and up and up. And over the last 50 years, that growth rate has averaged 2.4% per year, which is like doubling every 30 years or a factor of 10 every century. And this energy is wonderful. We're using some of it now. It allows us to do many, many great things. And alongside our rising use of energy, we have a rising technology. So it now allows us to do new and different things as well. And it's brought us many great things in life. But it's also true to say that as our technology and our energy use has been rising, we've gradually been becoming a more powerful species. And we exert with that increasing influence on the planet that we live on through a mixture of accident and design. And for centuries or millennia, it didn't matter that we were becoming more powerful because we could still treat the planet as though it was a big, robust playground of a place that could put itself back together again, no matter what we did to it. But that balance of power, if you like, between us and the planet gradually started to change. And really recently, it's completely flipped. So 100 years ago, we couldn't smash the place up, even if we had a world war. 50 years ago, we'd taken ourselves to a place where it was clear if we did something really stupid, like have a nuclear war, we could smash the whole planet up. But now we're at a point where we don't have to do anything obviously stupid, although we still do some of that. We just have to not be more careful than we've ever been. And we are finding that right now we are really smashing the place up at high speed. So next slide. So some people have a big word for it, and I've just got a very simple definition of it. So, we've entered this era called the Anthropocene, which just means we're in the era in which humans are suddenly the biggest thing affecting the ecosystem. And there's my little cartoon sketch for it. We've transitioned from being a small species on a big, robust playground of a planet to suddenly a huge, powerful species on a fragile planet. And that's a totally new context for humans to be operating in. The challenge for us is that we've been in this Anthropocene for a while now, a few decades maybe, and we've been able to get away with living as if we're not in it. But what's special about right now is it's clear if we don't make that transition, we're going to face a very, very nasty time. And what's challenging about it is that everything about how we do life, how we do economics, how we do politics, how we think, how we solve problems, how we run businesses, the whole lot has been honed in that previous era, pre-Anthropocene. So we have to identify and change the bits that aren't fit for purpose now at very high speed. Next slide. So what's it like in this Anthropocene? It's a very multi-dimensional challenge. So we hear about a climate emergency, of course, and linked to that an energy transition. And of course, transport is part of how we deal with that. And while we deal with that, we also need to deal with feeding a rising population without trashing our biodiversity, whilst dealing with all this sort of ton of pollutants, of which plastic is the most visible one, but not the only one. And at the same time, we have a kind of rising tide of disease threats, which some of which are coming from the way we're doing our food system. So we need to deal with this all at once. And I've drawn this diagram like the outer layer of an onion, if you like, because it's the kind of physical presenting challenges that we've got. And I want to start with some good news, which is that from a technical perspective, we've broadly speaking, we can broadly speaking crack all these challenges together at once. I'm not saying it's not challenging, but it turns out the technology is not the bottleneck. But let's have a look at how we're getting on. So next slide. Okay, so we know that the science on climate change has been clear for decades now, and we've had 27 COPs, 27 and big international conferences to try and get on top of the climate situation. So let's have a look at how we've been doing. Next slide. Right, so now I've shown a graph of the black line there is global emissions from fossil fuel use, and the thin blue stripe, vertical stripe you can see represents the first of those 27 COPs in 1995. And you can see that there's not the faintest hint of any sense at all that our emissions curve has responded to those COPs. In fact, if you were on another planet using this data to try and understand what's going on for humans right now, you'd see some dents in that line. You'd spot the pandemic, and you'd spot an economic crisis in 2008, but you wouldn't see any evidence at all, no evidence whatsoever that humans have spotted climate change yet. And I'm not saying this to be depressing. I'm saying this because it's important that we understand this, because it tells us a lot about the extent to which we need to raise our game. And it tells us, if we're clever, it'll give us some information about the kinds of things that aren't helping us and aren't enough, and the kinds of things that might be required. Next slide. So, why are we still, and I call it accelerating into this polycrisis, because the height of those lines represents the speed at which we are increasing the temperature on planet Earth. So we're not just still traveling towards a climate crisis. We are actually accelerating towards it still. And so why is that? Well, one of the big reasons has been, clear-cut, well-funded, deliberate lobbying and disinformation funded by the fossil fuel industry, using a template laid down by the tobacco industry when they worked out how to fend off science that was inconvenient for their businesses. And it has, it's one of the factors that is contributing towards this amazing phenomenon of human psychology, that we're still asleep on the job. And if I were to be optimistic about this, I would say that little picture of the head in the sand there is, I would say it's dragged itself the first millimeter of the way out of the sand. And of course, that first millimeter is the hardest one if you were trying to pull that head out of the sand. So, I don't know how close we are to this social tipping point that would allow us to suddenly wake up. But we could be very, very close, very, very close indeed. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and just some early symptoms. We hear about these early symptoms. I think all these pictures are self-explanatory, maybe, except for the top one in the middle, of which those puddles are craters in Siberia left by methane exploding out of the melting permafrost. And of course, methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas capable of causing more climate change. So, but one of the things that the scientific community is only just really starting to wake up to is the extent to which it might be possible that some of these climate change symptoms might in themselves trigger more climate change. And we might cross what's called a cascading tipping point. So next slide, please. So this is the idea that the methane exploding out of the permafrost causes more climate change, which causes more forests to dry out, which makes them more likely to catch fire, which makes them release more carbon dioxide, which causes more warming, which causes more ice to melt, which causes the Earth to become less reflective, which makes it absorb more heat, which causes more climate change. And there are other factors as well. So the oceans warming up may make them less able to absorb carbon dioxide, and so on. And when or have we reached a point at which these positive feedback mechanisms might be getting out of control? Well, the truth is, we don't know. It might be too late already. We think it's likely that it's not too late if we take very strong action now. But we should be very, very nervous about this. And let's have a look at some of the evidence we're getting now about what's going on in the climate that we've been getting this year, which I think is, it's consistent with, I'm not saying that we've crossed this tipping point, but it is consistent. It is the sort of evidence that we might see if we were crossing a tipping point like this. So next slide. Okay, so first of all, this is the sharply rising methane. It looked in the early 2000s as if it was sort of settling down, but now it's going up and up again, mainly from wetlands. Next slide. We've heard about some temperature records being broken this year, but what I want to emphasize about this is the amount by which we're breaking these records by. So this is Antarctic sea ice on the 7th of August was 11% below the previous record since records began, and that was only set last year. So this is like, if somebody broke the 100-meter running record by a couple of hundredths of a second, you'd say, well, that's impressive. I hope they weren't on drugs. But if they broke it by a second, you'd say, oh, hang on a sec, that's not right. Something really not right is happening now. Well, the Antarctic sea ice was a massive 11% below the previous record. Next slide. Okay, and average ocean temperature. This slide is just for to the 1st of August. Actually, there's an update on this for the 1st of September, which is even more alarming. So, and this is just showing, breaking the ocean temperature record by an enormous quarter of a degree, not just a small change in the temperature. So this is this level of record breaking is something that we should be really alarmed by. If we're not feeling some adrenaline about the kind of situation that we could be getting ourselves into here, then something's something's really not right in how we're thinking about this. Next slide. And then finally, so September, the hottest September since. And then what I want to emphasize about this is the amount by which we broke that record by. Something like 0.5 degrees. That's absolutely, this is land temperature, global average land temperature. That's absolutely an enormous thrashing of that record. Okay, next slide. And well, it's just one more slide again, showing how much we're breaking records by. And finally, just don't worry, we're going to get on to some more optimistic stuff now, but I do want to lay out the situation as I think we should be looking at it, because I should emphasize, I don't think it's a good idea ever or helpful to exaggerate what's going on, nor to underplay it. I think we need the clearest view of reality that we can get. And we don't understand the extent to which the kind of broadly stable, and it's not that stable, but broadly stable global civilization that we've known all my lifetime might be under threat. So we know, but we do know that climate affects food security, and food security affects and food security problems trigger warfare and civil strife and all kinds of other problems. So we've got these kind of, in terms of the global civilization as we know it, there's not just climate problems, there are threat multipliers associated with that. So at this point, I've laid out, I think I've laid out what is a pretty, it is a pretty alarming situation. But I want to know what you think of what I've said. So I think there's a question going out on the chat that you can respond to, and it's and you can take your time over this. We'll have a look at what the results are at the end. But do you believe, just in broad terms, that the poly price crisis is as serious as I've described it? Or have I fundamentally overrated it? And I think we can all argue about little details, but in broad terms, do you think it's about as serious as I've suggested, or do you think in broad terms I've just fundamentally overplayed it? And we'll have a look in a few minutes at what people think. Okay, next slide. And this is an interesting phenomenon in businesses that I find, which is that, and I think we all, to some extent, we all experience this, is that it is difficult to get someone to believe something when they think their salary depends on them not believing it. This is interesting, actually, because I think there are a lot of people who find the evidence on climate hard to look at, partly because they think their salary depends on them not believing it, but actually with a bit of creativity, there are plenty of pathways through. And that's what, in my work, I spend a lot of time encouraging people to explore. Okay, next slide. And depending on how you're voting just now and what your view of the situation is, I like to think that this is a one-way gate that we're going through. When we see what's going on, we can't look the other way. We can choose to look the other way, but we can't ever say again that we didn't know. And really, that is the challenge of us now, my generation, right now. Next slide. Okay, it's time for some good news. So first up, this is my simple illustration of how technically solvable the climate and energy situation is. So that dot is to scale, and it represents the size of solar panels that we would need to generate the whole of humanity's annual energy supply. Now, clearly, the energy transition is a lot more complex than that. We need to get the energy that we need to everyone who needs it when they need it, and in the form that they can use it in for all the things that they need energy for. But the good news is that if you look at that too, or getting all those details straight. It's challenging, but it's fundamentally a doable exercise. Next slide. But I said that we're growing our energy supply. So this is something I just want to emphasize, is that, you know, if we keep our energy use as it is at the moment, we just need one of those dots. But if we stay on the trajectory that we're on, in 100 years' time, we'd need 10 of them. In 200 years' time, we'd need 100 of those dots. And in 300 years' time, we'd need solar panels all over the world's land surface area and a big chunk of the ocean as well. And that's just my simple illustration of the point that actually we need to reduce the total amount of energy that we need. It's actually the single most important thing that we can do to facilitate the energy transition. And some people say, oh, well, you know, we have rising energy needs. We absolutely don't. At the global level, we don't have rising energy needs, even though there are some countries that legitimately do. But here in the developed world, we absolutely have rapidly shrinking energy needs because we're becoming so much more efficient at everything we do. Next slide. So this is my little sketch of what that energy and climate solution looks like, and I'll fill in some of the bubbles here. I've drawn this bubble, you know, we can argue about the detail here, but it's my simple illustration. And I've tried to draw each of the shapes here in terms of, to scale roughly, in terms of the amount we should be thinking about them. So next slide. So there we are. We need to, it just shows we need to generate all the energy that we need. We need to convert it into a form we can store it in. Then we need to store it. We need to transport it. Then we need to probably store it again, but just before we use it, for example, in cars and so on. And then it needs to be converted into the form that we can do our end usage in. And then we need the technologies to make sure that our end use can use use the form of energy that we've managed to convert it into. So next slide. Right, here are the biggest things, and I'm not going to talk through all the detail here, but the things that we don't talk about enough. We don't talk about, as I've said, demand reduction. It's the single biggest thing. We probably don't talk quite enough about solar power because it's at the global level, it's the biggest source of renewable energy. We don't talk about hydrogen because hydrogen is the means by which we're going to get to store our energy at scale. We can't do this through batteries and the scale that we need to, nor through hydro, nor any other form that we've got. Hydrogen's going to be really important. And we are going to need direct air carbon capture and storage, but it's not going to be the big, huge deal in energy transition that the fossil fuel companies would sometimes like us to believe it will be. Next slide. And then just to fill in a bit more detail, I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but down at the bottom right there, you can see that we're going to need a lot of new technology on our land transport, our sea transport, and our air transport. Next slide. Okay, let's have a look at where transport fits into all this. This is the carbon footprint of the average UK person. Actually, this slide comes from How Bad Are Bananas? And you can see that travel is for a UK person, it's the largest quarter, if I can say that, of our carbon footprint. Next slide. And to break it down a little bit more, just having a look at what's inside that travel component. I'm not going to talk through the yellow, red and blue chunks, but the travel bit, flights are a bigger deal than most people talk about most of the time. And that's because we're a rich island. And it's also because a lot of the time when people talk about the impact of flying, they ignore high altitude radiative forcing factors that are a big deal. But cars are, the biggest deal in this by far, not just the vehicle fuel, what comes out of the exhaust pipe, but also the emissions involved in extracting the fuel and converting it into a form that we can use it in cars and getting it to the petrol station in the first place. And also you can see a 3% there of our total carbon footprint is the manufacture of cars. And you can see a thin slither there at the top, top in green, trains, buses and other public transport. And that's the slither that we actually need to increase a bit so that we can to allow us to shrink everything associated with cars and vehicle fuel. But you know, obviously, cycling and so on and walking are the best forms of transport we can have. Next slide. All right, this is just a slide about, I had a look at air pollution. This is so the extent to which when you're driving a polluting vehicle around, the extent to which you actually take life away from the people around you by making them breathe in bad air. And you can see that the top three diagrams are a rural setting, and the bottom three charts show driving in a congested urban setting. And that we've got an electric car, so there's a little bit of air pollution actually coming off the tires and the brakes. And then we've got a petrol car, there's much more pollution. But then we've got a diesel car in an urban setting. You actually, you can expect to take 12 minutes of life. If you combine if you add up the extent to which you reduce by a tiny fraction the life expectancy of all the people you drive past per mile, then it will come to a total of 12 minutes. Obviously, these are just rough estimates, but I think that's a pretty enormous figure for just 1 mile of driving through an urban setting in a diesel car. So it shows diesel very, very bad compared to petrol, but of course, none of these things are that great. Next slide. And now this is my simple sketch just to illustrate how fantastic bikes are, but especially electric bikes. So, you know, come the renewable, sustainable energy world, we'll need land one way or another for nearly all of our transport. Either we could use that land to grow a biofuel and use that biofuel to power a car. And so this is sunny Californian land I've picked as my example here. If we did that, a square meter of land would be able to give you 5 miles worth of travel per year. Or alternatively, we could grow wheat and turn the wheat into bread and use that to feed a cyclist. And that gets you 5 times further, fantastic. But what if we put solar panels on that land and use it to power an electric car? Actually, that's dramatically more effective. It's quite shocking to me, this. 1,000 miles per year from a square meter of land. But what if we used it to power an electric bike? Actually, I've cheated slightly. It's more like an electric scooter with no pedaling involved. And then you can get a massive 20,000 miles from just 1 meter of land. So electric bikes are, you know, ordinary bikes are fantastic too in different ways. And both electric bikes and non-electric bikes keep you healthy. But electric bikes enable greater distances and are just a fabulous way of getting around. Next slide. I'll skip over this one. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've said that all these things are technically solvable. The question is, what would it take for us to be solving these technically solvable challenges? Next slide. Next, there we go. All right, so that takes us into questions, as I've mentioned, of how we do economics, how we run businesses, what it's still okay to grow, how we invest, how we do politics, media, education, inequality, and our relationship with technology, because we need to get much better at picking which technologies we go with and which ones we leave on the shelf. But I've left up a hole in the core of this onion to get to what I think is the absolute critical issues now for us all to be really focusing on if we want to get on top of all of this stuff. And for anyone in the UK, this is really critical right now. Next slide. Because so somewhere, right at the core of that onion, I talk about values, just very simple values, and those 3 simple values are to respect the environment more, to get much better at respecting all people, whoever they are, whatever country they're in, and however rich they are. And to get much better at respecting the truth, because we have to do much better than this. At the moment, I've got at the top of this slide, I've got people whose lives basically aren't being respected. They're in food banks or crossing oceans or in prisons where because it's profitable to run prisons, and at the bottom we've got people whose lives are are incredibly wealthy, but also being profligate with their wealth, and damaging in the way that they're using their wealth. Next slide. So there we are. It values at the center of this. Next slide. And these are the three that I think we need to focus on: respect the environment, respect for all people, and respect for truth. And this is really critical in the UK right now and elsewhere. Next slide. Okay, and when it's all so global, what can any of us do about this? That's the question, because I've laid out a really systemic challenge. And it's easy for any of us to think, oh, well, I'm just a speck. There's nothing I can do about it. Next slide. Well, the first thing is we need to get much, much better at being discerning about which ones of these faces we can trust to give us the clearest view of the truth that we can get, and vote for them, and which of these media sources can we trust to give us the clearest view and read that media only. We need to get much, much more discerning about this. At the moment, there are quite a lot of politicians routinely lying to us, and we can't get anywhere at all on climate until we can change the quality of decision making that we're getting, and that means changing the view that we're getting of reality. Next slide. And the way to frame up the question is to ask, well, how can I help to create the conditions under which humanity can undergo the systemic changes that it so urgently needs? And that's a much bigger question than just how can I cut my carbon footprint. But what you can do with sustainable travel and sustainable commuting and so on is you can send out a very powerful message about the way the world needs to change and how that change can become part of living a better life and improving our quality of life. So although, in some ways it can feel at face value like a relatively small emission saving in the scheme of the global change, the cultural message that can go with it multiplies that power enormously. Next slide. Okay, so personally living greener is part of it, and then all the other ways in which we can push for change, which definitely includes how we vote, and might even include whether we take to the streets or not. Because we need to have the maximum leverage that we can, and that's a personal question for all of us to ask. Next slide. For time, I'll have to skim over this, but just on honesty, when one person deliberately misleads us on a topic, it tells us a lot. Next slide. It tells us we can't trust them on that topic again. Next slide. It tells us that we can't trust them on anything because they're fundamentally untrustworthy. Next slide. It tells us we can't trust any of their colleagues who allow that misinformation to stand unchallenged. It tells us that those colleagues are also untrustworthy. Next slide. And this lasts forever unless somebody has, there's convincing evidence of a fundamentally redemptive experience. And I think if you apply these criteria to some of today's politicians, a lot of today's politicians in the UK, you'd actually end up ruling a lot of them out for being fundamentally fit for politics. And we have to raise the game on that. Next slide. Because we can aim for a much better world. What we can have is a world that's just nicer to live in as well as more sustainable. Next slide. But I just want to leave us with a sense of a race between tipping points. Can we wake up in time, or will the ecology tip against us? And I do think it's a flat out race, and I don't know what the odds are, but I wouldn't like to speculate, but we should be nervous. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Well, that was a fantastic presentation, and I guess what we're going to do now is firstly review the poll results. Well, we know, of course, that we're preaching here a little bit to the converted. This is a Zero Carbon Commuting Conference, and so we know that the audience that we're likely to attract here was going to somewhat agree. But it's interesting there, isn't it, Mike, how overwhelming, 90-some%. I believe we've got about 400 people concurrently watching right now. And 182 participated in that poll. So overwhelming support for the case you put for the polycrisis. What I'd like to do, we've got about 10 minutes, and I'd like us to take questions directly from the audience. I know we've got dozens of questions going in, and so let's have the audience questions pulled up, and we'll put them over to Mike. So one thing that really struck me was the idea that we're taking life away every time we drive a mile. And so, you know, the idea, even in an EV, you're driving along in the middle of London, that mile that you do is 30 seconds off the population's life. Really, it is something to make you think every time you hop in the car, whatever that car is. But the top question we have here is from Lucy Northey. How do you encourage people who think their actions can't make a difference, given all the other challenges going on in the world?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. And I try to address it a little bit because it's easy for us all to think we're just a speck. But the answer is, I think, you know, to have agency, you ask that bigger question: what can I do to create the conditions? And that's that under which we can undergo this big systemic change. And I do imagine a very sudden tipping point in global culture. And the actions that we can take can have multiplier effects. So if you can get a business to be thinking differently about commuting, for example, it helps to change it. Also, you can also do it in a way that helps to change the way people think about how they make decisions and how they live and how we and the things that we care about and the fundamental values. And that starts giving the businesses they work for permission to operate differently, and the politicians who are looking at those businesses permission to go and take climate more seriously. And what we do in the UK can be an exemplar for what goes on in the rest of the world, and we create the conditions under which it's easier for politicians everywhere, and I include China and all the rest of it, you know, in that. So it's all, you know, it's building out that snowball effect. I think that's how we can have a sense of realistic agency.
Well, it's interesting here because the next top question here from Charlotte Harris, it kind of builds on that a bit, because it's talking about, you know, public interest peaks when there are natural disasters that can be attributed to climate change, floods, etc. So how do we keep sustained interest even when there are not climate disasters that are in the news?
I think this is also a really, really interesting question. And I think one of the things I want to encourage people to do is to be really strong about remembering that we've got a climate crisis, because we had that poll just now, and practically everybody, I mean, 97% is incredibly, it's very near 100%, right? Practically everybody agrees that it's a very, very serious situation. And yet, if you turn on the news, or you listen to the Today program or whatever, you will sometimes hear a little bit about climate. But what you won't hear is an overriding sense that this is a flat out emergency situation, and it should be affecting every single news item, and it should be affecting every single thing that we do. You know, the message you pick up from the media is that it's basically the appropriate response is business as usual. And we all like to sort of, most of the time, we all like to fit into the culture. So what I want to emphasize is that, you know, it takes a lot of strength to remember this is the agenda we've got at the moment. This is what's going on. And remember that, you know, 97% of people get this message. And so when you're in a room at work having a meeting about something, you know, it might feel awkward to talk as if we're in a climate emergency and keep coming back to it all the time. But actually, 97% of people get it. Or, you know, even if it's not 97% in your workplace, most people will get it. And, you know, if you're in a room full of people who do get it, just don't let anybody, you know, get away with talking as if it's not going on. We have a duty to keep this up the agenda, even if we're not getting what we need from our media or our politicians.
Well, interestingly, we've got almost 1,000 registrants for this event, and I think 400 concurrent watching at the moment. And our back of the envelope maths shows that those people work for organizations that employ over 2.8 million people here in the UK. And of course, there's also some people from local authorities and regional transport authorities that have regions far more. So this next question from Peter Wright, I'm going to rephrase it a little. What do you think is the best way of persuading employees in our organizations to put pressure on politicians to invest in action now when the benefits are mostly in the future?
Well, the thing about right now is that now we know this is going on, it doesn't feel good to live as if it's not going on. And I think because of that, the benefit is now, actually. The benefit is short term. If you know, and I think, you know, I don't want to get too deep into the psychology of this, but I do think that it hangs, the knowledge that we're not living the way we need to be living hangs around us collectively like a lead weight. And I actually think as we wake up and start taking the action that we need to take, I actually think it will feel brilliant. I think the sense of relief that we're finally on it instead of burying it at the back of our minds the whole time will be enormous. And I think we'll actually feel like we're coming alive.
I mean, one of the questions that's just been selected here, it kind of builds on that big ticket publicity thing a bit that we've been talking about in these Q&As, because you put that slide up of all the previous COPs, and then that graph, when I've got the phrase, I actually wrote it down, not the faintest hint you said of any change since those have been going when you look at the graphs. And this question here from Callum Southgate, do you think hosting COPs is a worthwhile use of time and resources? Because of course, they're hugely polluting, big events. They do capture a bit of press and media for a couple of weeks, but the output, as you presented, doesn't seem to exist.
No, we need the COPs, but the COPs aren't enough. And you know, when we have this social tipping point that enables us to finally get on top of it, it will come from everywhere. And one of the things that will happen is when people go to those COPs, they will know that everybody they represent is screaming for them to take action. The politicians will know that their political careers depend on how hard they push and how successful they are at getting headway on those COPs. And the fossil fuel companies, you know, will be properly put in their place. I mean, at the next COP, they're going to be lobbying really hard. Their representation at the next COP is going to be enormous. But you know, we'll find a way of putting them in their place, and you know, public pressure for that will be enormously impactful. So we do need the COPs, but there's no way that process on its own is going to do it.
Okay, we're going to change a little bit here. This next question takes us into a different sort of area. We've got a session later that's focused on behavior change. And this question from Adam Sammons, can better understanding of an individual commuting carbon footprint influence their choice, or does it need reframing to something more relatable? And I think here the essence of this is tons of CO2, kilos of CO2. And you know, in your first book, you obviously detail that and everything. It's useful for us to benchmark, compare all that milk. What does that do? That coffee compared to tea. But it's still quite ethereal, isn't it? It doesn't quite, whereas the minutes for the car really made that resonate, you know, the minutes off life.
Yeah. I mean, I think numbers have their place, but they're not, you know, they don't do it for everybody all the time. But I think we need to use the numbers to understand which basic messages are important to put out there. And, you know, the basic things are that, you know, the best forms of transport are any form of bicycle. Electric bicycles are also fantastic. Walking is fantastic. If you're going to have to drive, then an electric car is the best the best one to have if you can do that. But all cars have a big impact. You know, those sorts of broad messages, you know, and nearly all public transport is dramatically better than any form of car. You know, those kinds of messages, and combine them with the messages about clean air and living longer and children having healthier environments to develop their brains in, and people not getting asthma and all that kind of stuff. You know, so you know, we can translate them. We can use the numbers to bring out qualitative messages that for many people stimulate a much more visceral reaction to why better forms of commuting feel better too.
Excellent. We are now a little out of time, but thank you so much, Professor Berners-Lee. What a really great presentation. Now, you've got a new book that you're actually writing right now. And I know your publishers are keen for you to get it out on time for spring 2024. So thank you so much for interrupting your writing time to come and give this great talk. And we'd love, of course, when you've finished your book in around April, May, I believe it's going to be published, 2024.
A bit later.
To do something with you. Thank you so much.